The story I'm about to tell you happened to me a few years ago when I was younger and living at my parents' house. It still to this day terrifies me, and ever since that night, I have never been the same. My parents have a beautiful house on a hill in California. I guess you could say I'm lucky because houses in California are so expensive, and my parents have done well for themselves. The 4th of July just passed, and my parents had the week off, so every year they usually go up to our camp in Arizona. Most years I went with them, almost like a family vacation, but this year I decided to stay home with my dog, Jinx. Well, my parents left that morning, and all day Jinx and I just hung out. I was still a little slow from the 4th of July because I went out and partied, and Jinx was honestly just happy because I was home, feeding him leftovers from it. Where we were on the hill, there were a lot of forest and coyotes, but they never came around during the day. Jinx was a pretty big dog, so I would keep him off leash during the day, but never at night because he was the kind of dog that would run toward danger. Well, nighttime came and we were in the house just watching TV. That's when I heard them. It was normal to hear coyotes howl at night, but on this night, I didn't hear coyotes. I heard what sounded like a group of people howling. Where I was, it was pretty secluded, and we did have neighbors, but the reality of people howling in the night where I lived would have meant that they were trespassing. I wasn't too worried because my dad was a hunter and a tech guy, so we had really good security and cameras all around, and I figured it was just a prank, maybe by my friends or some people stumbling drunk in the woods. But when I looked around, Jinx was nowhere to be found, and the terror started to set in, and that's when I realized I left the door from my house to the garage open, and the garage was open too. Jinx must have ran out towards the howling sounds. I immediately went into a trance, like when you think your dog is lost. I must not have been thinking, because the eerie howling sounds continued, but I ran out of the garage calling for Jinx anyway. And that's when I saw them. The howls were indeed coming from a group of people that were in the distance. I couldn't tell if they could see me from where I was standing outside my house, but here I was, standing in terror while these strange group of people were howling like coyotes after celebrating a kill. I wanted to call for Jinx, but I was afraid that they might hear me. And I must have thought what was happening was so strange that I walked closer, being careful not to be seen. What I saw was absolutely horrifying. There were 5 people yelling at the top of their lungs, and they looked totally morbid. I swear, in that moment, I remember smelling a rancid odor in the distance as well. I couldn't believe what I was watching, or that these people actually exist in the world. But there I was, outside of the home I lived in for 20 years, being occupied by a group of rabid humans. My heart was beating out of my chest. The group of people had their backs to me, and they were all on their hands and knees. That's when it clicked. They were celebrating a kill. They were eating something. And that's when all hope was lost for me. Did they kill Jinx? I don't know if I had a guardian angel watching over me that night, but as I was processing this in my head, I instinctively looked back at my house, and there Jinx was. His head was in the garbage can that was knocked over. I couldn't believe it, and I quickly made my way back to the house, grabbed Jinx by his collar, shut my garage door, and made sure all the doors in my house were locked. The howling continued for a while longer, but then it was total silence. It was pretty late into the night by then, but I finally called the police, and they came shortly after. But when they did a check of the area, they said that they didn't find anything, and it must have been some people that were drunk or still celebrating the 4th of July. I knew what I saw, but there was nothing I can do in that moment. Jinx and I stayed up all night, and I was so horrified that the group would come back. Who were they? Why were they here? And what were they doing that night in those woods? I lived with my parents for a few years after that, and they never came back. I'm not really sure how to tell this story, so I'm going to do the best I can. In order to tell the entire story, I need to go back to the beginning. It started a few months ago when my grandfather passed away. Even though it was extremely sad, I was fortunate enough to inherit his home. Once all the legal business was out of the way, I decided to stay there for a little bit while I decided if I was going to keep the house or sell it. The house was beautiful, and it was big, but it was very old-fashioned and it wasn't in the best part of town. I figured I would stay there for a little while, clean out the house while I was making the decision. One thing about my grandpa was that he was a hoarder. He just kept everything. So I knew getting organized was going to be a nightmare. About a week into me cleaning the house, I found what looked like a diary or a journal that was in between his mattress and his box spring. I was excited to read it. Not for any juicy details or anything like that, but instead I was just excited to get a glimpse into my grandfather's mind. When my grandma died 5 years ago, it hit my grandpa hard. I remember one time he briefly mentioned in passing that he was writing in his journal as a way to cope with the loss of his wife. I forgot all about that until I found the journal myself. That night, I ate some food and I started to flip through the pages. At first, it was nice. It was like he was writing love letters to his deceased wife. Then, eventually he started writing about a man that was in his closet. It was creepy and unsettling. I started to feel bad because I thought this was my grandpa losing his mind. He would talk about how he would wake up every night around 3 a.m. to the man in his closet talking to him. He mentioned that, at first, he thought it was my grandma communicating with him. But the voice identified itself as a man, and the man was there to take my grandpa away. I was sad reading this because my grandpa was clearly struggling, and he never mentioned this to any of us. I continued to read, and the passages got darker and darker. He started to talk about how he would cry at night and beg for the dark entity to leave him alone. Finally, the last few pages were a warning for the reader. It said to ignore the voice and don't listen to anything it says. It gave me goosebumps because I felt like my grandpa was talking to me. Even more horrifying to me was that the date of the journal entry was the day before my grandpa passed away. I was upset that night after reading the journal. I remember I got into bed around midnight and I didn't even watch TV or anything. I just reflected on my thoughts alone in the dark house. I passed out at some point and I was awoken randomly in the middle of the night. I looked at my phone and it was shortly after 3 a.m. I looked around trying to figure out why I woke up, but nothing seemed out of place. As I closed my eyes, I heard my name. I jumped out of bed and looked around. I didn't see anything in the dark room. I shined the flashlight on my phone around the room, and again, I didn't see anything out of the normal. As I stood there, I heard my name again, and this time it was telling me to open the door. The voice was clearly coming from the closet. I instantly remembered my grandpa's journal, and my stomach sank. The voice just kept antagonizing me and telling me to open the door, but the voice never went above a whisper. While I was trying to figure out what was happening, the door flung open and the whisper turned into a horrible and guttural growl. I grabbed my phone and ran out of the house. I never went back into that house after dark ever again. Nobody believed me when I told them what happened, and honestly, I don't care if they do. I know what I witnessed. My girlfriend thinks it was my subconscious after reading the journal, but it just felt so real. I think it's worth noting that I have no prior history with any episodes like this. I like to think it was the spirit of my grandparents giving me the strength to run out of the house that evening. I eventually sold the house, and whatever that voice was, I never witnessed it again. And I hope I never do. My wife has to travel every weekend for work. I usually don't mind as it gives me time to play video games or watch basketball on TV. She leaves on Friday around noon and doesn't get back until Sunday around 6 in the evening. My weekends usually don't change much. It's not a great habit, but I usually order a pizza every Friday and Saturday night. On this specific weekend, I ordered a pizza on Friday, as always, and when the guy delivered it, I could tell he was annoyed. He didn't say anything, but sometimes you just know when someone is acting weird. It made me apprehensive to order pizza on Saturday, but I still did. When the guy dropped it off, he gave me an attitude for not tipping enough. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I always tipped 30% for my delivery drivers, which I believe is more than fair. He basically walked away ranting, and I decided that I would probably not order pizza from this place again. I remember being a little angry, but I still enjoyed my food. That night before I went to bed, I called my wife, and I told her about the angry delivery driver. She laughed about it and then abruptly paused. I asked her why she stopped laughing, and then she asked where I ordered the pizza from. Well, long story short, the place where I ordered the pizza is where her ex-boyfriend works, and apparently, given the description, it sounded like he was the one that was delivering the food. I was slightly annoyed, but just decided to move on because it wasn't worth my time. That night, around 2 a.m, I woke up to a strange scratching noise. I sat up in bed and started to listen intently. The noise was becoming much clearer. It wasn't scratching, it was the sound of rustling, and it sounded like it was coming from right outside my window in my bedroom. I got up slowly from the bed and went and grabbed my softball bat, which was in the living room. When I got to the living room, I noticed that the motion light from the driveway was turned on. I started to get even more nervous that someone was outside my house. On my way back into the bedroom, I walked by the back sliding door, and I saw muddy footprints that led to the door. I contemplated calling the police, but I didn't at that moment. I walked back into the bedroom, and I could still hear the rustling coming from behind the curtain. Against my better judgment, I whipped back the curtain, and standing right outside the window was a man. I must have startled him because he grunted and fell backwards. After hitting the ground, his Yankees baseball cap fell off, and he ran into the darkness of night. I was shaking. I was so scared, but was relieved that whoever this was got scared. This is finally when I called the police and reported the entire incident. The more I thought about the man at the window, the more I was connecting the dots to the appearance of the delivery driver and the appearance of what the intruder was wearing. I told this detail to the police, but I don't think they ever followed up on this. Thankfully, nothing ever happened, at least nothing to my knowledge. Every weekend that I'm alone now, I have one of my buddies come over because I'm terrified of being home alone. I don't have any real answers, and I wish more than anything that I did. I'm just happy that nothing serious happened and that I'm alive and well so I can tell this story.